Brought to you by WikiVidi.com. United States Presidential Election, 2016. The United States presidential election of 2016 was the 58th quadrennial American presidential election held on Tuesday, November 8, 2016. In a surprise victory, the Republican ticket of businessman Donald Trump and Indiana Governor Mike Pence defeated the Democratic ticket of former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and U.S. Senator from Virginia Tim Kaine. Trump took office as the 45th president, and Pence as the 48th vice president on January 20, 2017. Concurrent with the presidential election, Senate, House and many gubernatorial and state and local elections were also held on November 8. Voters selected members of the Electoral College in each state in most cases by winner-takes-all plurality. Those state electors in turn voted for a new president and vice president on December 19, 2016. While Clinton received about a million more votes nationwide, a margin of %, Trump won 30 states, with a total of 306 electors, of 57% of the 538 available. He won the 4 perennial swing states of Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, and Iowa, as well as the 3 blue wall stronghold states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, which had not been won by a Republican presidential candidate since the 1980s. Leading up to the election, a Trump victory was considered unlikely by almost all media forecasts. In the Electoral College vote on December 19, 7 electors voted against their pledged candidates, 2 against Trump and 5 against Clinton. A further 3 electors attempted to vote against Clinton but were replaced or forced to vote again. Ultimately, Trump received 304 electoral votes and Clinton garnered 227, while Colin Powell won 3 and John Kasich, Ron Paul, Bernie Sanders, and Faith Spotted Eagle each received 1. Trump is the 5th person in the U.S. history to become president while losing the nationwide popular vote. He is the first president without any prior experience in public service or the military, as well as the wealthiest and the oldest at inauguration, while Clinton was the first woman to be the presidential nominee of a major American party. On January 6, 2017, the United States government's intelligence agencies concluded that the Russian government interfered in the 2016 United States elections. A joint U.S. intelligence review stated, with high confidence, that Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an influence campaign in 2016 aimed at the U.S. presidential election. Russia's goals were to undermine public faith in the U.S. democratic process, denigrate Secretary Clinton, and harm her electability and potential presidency. Investigations about potential collusion between the Trump campaign and Russian officials were started by the FBI, the Senate Intelligence Committee, and the House Intelligence Committee. President Donald Trump has criticized these conclusions, alleging a lack of evidence, repeatedly calling them a hoax and fake news. Background. Article 2 of the United States Constitution provides that the President and Vice President of the United States must be natural-born citizens of the United States, at least 35 years old, and residents of the United States for a period of at least 14 years. Candidates for the presidency typically seek the nomination of one of the political parties, in which case each party devises a method to choose the candidate the party deems best suited to run for the position. Traditionally, the primary elections are indirect elections, where voters cast ballots for a slate of party delegates pledged to a particular candidate. The party's delegates then officially nominate a candidate to run on the party's behalf. The general election in November is also an indirect election where voters cast ballots 4 or slate of members of the Electoral College. These electors in turn directly elect the President and Vice President. President Barack Obama, a Democrat and former U.S. Senator from Illinois, was ineligible to seek re-election to a third term due to the restrictions of the 22nd Amendment. In accordance with Section I of the 20th Amendment, his term expired at noon on January 20, 2017. Primary process. The series of presidential primary elections and caucuses took place between February and June 2016, staggered among the 50 states, the District of Columbia, and U.S. territories. This nominating process was also an indirect election where voters cast ballots for a slate of delegates to a political party's nominating convention, who in turn elected their party's presidential nominee. Speculation about the 2016 campaign began almost immediately following the 2012 campaign, with New York Magazine declaring the race had begun in an article published on November 8, 2 days after the 2012 election. On the same day, Politico released an article predicting the 2016 general election would be between Clinton and former Florida Governor Jeb Bush, while a New York Times article named New Jersey Governor Chris Christie and Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey as potential candidates. Primaries. With 17 major candidates entering the race, starting with Ted Cruz on March 23, 2015. This was the largest presidential primary field for any political party in American history. Prior to the Iowa caucuses on February 1, 2016, Perry, Walker, Jindal, Graham and Pataki withdrew due to low polling numbers. Despite leading many polls in Iowa, Trump came in second to Cruz, after which Huckabee, Paul and Santorum withdrew due to poor performances at the ballot box. Following a sizable victory for Trump in the New Hampshire primary, Christie, Fiorina and Gilmore abandoned the race. Bush followed suit after scoring fourth place to Trump, Rubio, and Cruz in South Carolina. On March 1, 2016, the first of 4 Super Tuesday primaries, Rubio won his first contest in Minnesota, Cruz won Alaska, Oklahoma and his home of Texas, and Trump won the other 7 states that voted. Failing to gain traction, Carson suspended his campaign a few days later. On March 15, 2016, the second Super Tuesday, Kasich won his only contest in his home state of Ohio, and Trump won 5 primaries including Florida. Rubio suspended his campaign after losing his home state. Between March 16 and May 3, 2016, only 3 candidates remained in the race: Trump, Cruz and Kasich. Cruz won the most delegates in 4 Western contests and in Wisconsin, keeping a credible path to denying Trump the nomination on first ballot with 1,237 delegates. Trump then augmented his lead by scoring landslide victories in New York and 5 northeastern states in April, followed by a decisive victory in Indiana on May 3, 2016, securing all 57 of the state's delegates. Without any further chances of forcing a contested convention, both Cruz and Kasich suspended their campaigns. Trump remained the only active candidate and was declared the presumptive Republican nominee by Republican National Committee Chairman Reince Priebus on the evening of May 3, 2016. Other major candidates. Major candidates were determined by the various media based on common consensus. The following were invited to sanction televised debates based on their poll ratings. Trump received 14,010,177 total votes in the primary. Trump, Cruz, Rubio and Kasich each won at least one primary, with Trump receiving the highest number of votes and Ted Cruz receiving the second highest. Vice presidential selection. Trump turned his attention towards selecting a running mate after he became the presumptive nominee on May 4, 2016. In mid-June, Eli Stokols and Burgess Everett of Politico reported that the Trump campaign was considering New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich from Georgia, Senator Jeff Sessions of Alabama, and Oklahoma Governor Mary Fallin. A June 30 report from the Washington Post also included Senators Bob Corker from Tennessee, Richard Burr from North Carolina, Tom Cotton from Arkansas, Joni Ernst from Iowa, and Indiana Governor Mike Pence as individuals still being considered for the ticket. Trump also stated that he was considering 2 military generals for the position, including retired Lieutenant General Michael Flynn. In July 2016, it was reported that Trump had narrowed his list of possible running mates down to 3: Christie, Gingrich and Pence. On July 14, 2016, several major media outlets reported that Trump had selected Pence as his running mate. Trump confirmed these reports in a message on Twitter on July 15, 2016. And formally made the announcement the following day in New York. On July 19, the second night of the 2016 Republican National Convention, Pence won the Republican vice presidential nomination by acclamation. Primaries. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who also served in the U.S. Senate and was the First Lady of the United States, became the first woman to formally launch a major candidacy for the presidency. Clinton made the announcement on April 12, 2015 via a video message. While nationwide opinion polls in 2015 indicated that Clinton was the front-runner for the 2016 Democratic presidential nomination, she faced extreme challenges from independent Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, who became the second major candidate when he formally announced on April 30, 2015 that he was running for the Democratic nomination. September 2015 polling numbers indicated a narrowing gap between Clinton and Sanders. On May 30, 2015, former Governor of Maryland Martin O'Malley was the third major candidate to enter the Democratic primary race, followed by former independent governor and Republican Senator of Rhode Island Lincoln Chafee on June 3, 2015. Former Virginia Senator Jim Webb on July 2, 2015. And former Harvard Law professor Lawrence Lessig on September 6, 2015. On October 20, 2015, Webb announced his withdrawal from the Democratic primaries and explored a potential independent run. The next day, Vice President Joe Biden decided not to run, ending months of speculation, stating, "While I will not be a candidate, I will not be silent." On October 23, Chafee withdrew, stating that he hoped for an end to the endless wars and the beginning of a new era for the United States and humanity. On November 2, after failing to qualify for the second DNC-sanctioned debate after adoption of a rule change negated polls which before might have necessitated his inclusion in the debate, Lessig withdrew as well, narrowing the field to Clinton, O'Malley and Sanders. On February 1, 2016, in an extremely close contest, Clinton won the Iowa caucuses by a margin of 0.2 points over Sanders. After winning no delegates in Iowa, O'Malley withdrew from the presidential race that day. On February 9, Sanders bounced back to win the New Hampshire primary with 60% of the vote. In the remaining two February contests, Clinton won the Nevada caucuses with 53% of the vote and scored a decisive victory in the South Carolina primary with 73% of the vote. On March 1, 11 states participated in the first of four Super Tuesday primaries. Clinton won Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Massachusetts, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia, and 504 pledged delegates. while Sanders won Colorado, Minnesota, Oklahoma, and his home state of Vermont and 340 delegates. The following weekend Sanders won victories in Kansas, Nebraska, and Maine with 15 30-point margins, while Clinton won the Louisiana primary with 71% of the vote. On March 8, despite never having a lead in the Michigan primary, Sanders won by a small margin of 1.5 points, and outperforming polls by over 19 points, while Clinton won 83% of the vote in Mississippi. On March 15, the second Super Tuesday, Clinton won in Florida, Illinois, Missouri, North Carolina, and Ohio. Between March 22 and April 9, Sanders won 6 caucuses in Idaho, Utah, Alaska, Hawaii, Washington, and Wyoming, as well as the Wisconsin primary, while Clinton won the Arizona primary. On April 19, Clinton won the New York primary with 58% of the vote. On April 26 and the third Super Tuesday, dubbed the Acela primary, she won contests in Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, while Sanders won in Rhode Island. Over the course of May, Sanders accomplished another surprise win in the Indiana primary and also won in West Virginia and Oregon, while Clinton won the Guam caucus and Kentucky primary. On June 4 and 5, Clinton won 2 victories in the Virgin Islands caucus and Puerto Rico primary. On June 6, 2016, the Associated Press and NBC News reported that Clinton had become the presumptive nominee after reaching the required number of delegates, including pledged delegates and superdelegates, to secure the nomination, becoming the first woman to ever clinch the presidential nomination of a major United States political party. On June 7, Clinton secured a majority of pledged delegates after winning primaries in California, New Jersey, New Mexico, and South Dakota, while Sanders only won in Montana and North Dakota. Clinton also won the final primary in the District of Columbia on June 14. At the conclusion of the primary process, Clinton had won 2,204 pledged delegates awarded by the primary elections and caucuses, while Sanders had won 1,847 out of the 714 unpledged delegates for superdelegates who were set to vote in the convention in July. Clinton received endorsements from 560. While Sanders received 47. Although Sanders had not formally dropped out of the race, he announced on June 16, 2016 that his main goal in the coming months would be to work with Clinton to defeat Trump in the general election. On July 8, appointees from the Clinton campaign, the Sanders campaign, and the Democratic National Committee negotiated a draft of the party's platform. On July 12, Sanders formally endorsed Clinton at a rally in New Hampshire in which he appeared with her. On July 22, 3 days before the start of the Democratic National Convention, the Clinton campaign announced that Virginia Senator Tim Kaine had been selected as her running mate. Other major candidates. The following candidates were frequently interviewed by major broadcast networks and cable news channels or were listed in publicly published national polls. Lessig was invited to one forum but withdrew when rules were changed which prevented him from participating in officially sanctioned debates. Clinton received 16,849,779 votes in the primary. Vice presidential selection. In April 2016, the Clinton campaign began to compile a list of 15 to 20 individuals to vet for the position of running mate, even though Sanders continued to challenge Clinton in the Democratic primaries. In mid-June, The Wall Street Journal reported that Clinton's shortlist included Representative Xavier Becerra from California, Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey, Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio, Housing and Urban Development Secretary Julian Castro from Texas, Mayor of Los Angeles Eric Garcetti from California, Senator Tim Kaine from Virginia, Labor Secretary Tom Perez from Maryland, Representative Tim Ryan from Ohio, and Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts. Subsequent reports stated that Clinton was also considering Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack, retired Admiral James Stavridis, and Governor John Hickenlooper of Colorado. In discussing her potential vice presidential choice, Clinton stated that the most important attribute she looked for was the ability and experience to immediately step into the role of president. On July 22, Clinton announced that she had chosen Senator Tim Kaine from Virginia as her running mate. The delegates at the 2016 Democratic National Convention, which took place July 25, 2008, formally nominated the Democratic ticket. Third parties and independents. Third-party and independent candidates that have obtained more than 100,000 votes nationally, and 1% of the vote in at least one state are listed separately. General election campaign. Hillary Clinton focused her candidacy on several themes, including raising middle-class incomes, expanding women's rights, instituting campaign finance reform, and improving the Affordable Care Act. In March 2016, she laid out a detailed economic plan basing her economic philosophy on inclusive capitalism, which proposed a clawback which would rescind tax relief and other benefits for companies that move jobs overseas, with provision of incentives for companies that share profits with employees, communities, and the environment, rather than focusing on short-term profits to increase stock value and rewarding shareholders, as well as increasing collective bargaining rights, and placing an exit tax on companies that move their headquarters out of America in order to pay a lower tax rate overseas. Clinton promoted equal pay for equal work, to address current alleged shortfalls in how much women are paid to do the same jobs men do. Promoted explicitly focus on family issues and support of universal preschool, expressed support for the right to same-sex marriage, and proposed allowing undocumented immigrants to have a path to citizenship, stating that it is at its heart a family issue. Donald Trump's campaign drew heavily on his personal image, enhanced by his previous media exposure. The primary slogan of the Trump campaign, extensively used on campaign merchandise, was "Make America Great Again." The red baseball cap, with the slogan emblazoned on the front, became a symbol of the campaign, and has been frequently donned by Trump and his supporters. Trump's right-wing populist positions, reported by The New Yorker to be nativist, protectionist, and semi-isolationist, differ in many ways from traditional conservatism. He opposed many free trade deals and military interventionist policies that conservatives generally support, and opposed cuts in Medicare and Social Security benefits. Moreover, he has insisted that Washington is broken and can only be fixed by an outsider. Trump's support was high among working and middle-class white male voters, with annual incomes of less than $50,000 and no college degree. This group, particularly those with less than a high school education, suffered a decline in their income in recent years. According to the Washington Post, support for Trump is higher in areas with a higher mortality rate for middle-aged white people. A sample of interviews with more than 11,000 Republican-leaning respondents from August to December 2015 found that Trump, at that time, found his strongest support among Republicans in West Virginia, followed by New York, and then followed by 6 southern states. Clinton had an uneasy and, at times, adversarial relationship with the press throughout her life in public service. Weeks before her official entry as a presidential candidate, Clinton attended a political press corps event pledging to start fresh on what she described as a complicated relationship with political reporters. Clinton was initially criticized by the press for avoiding taking their questions, after which she provided more interviews. In contrast, Trump benefited from free media more than any other candidate. From the beginning of his campaign through February 2016, Trump received almost $2 billion in free media attention, twice the amount that Clinton received. According to data from the Tyndall Report, which tracks nightly news content through February 2016, Trump alone accounted for more than a quarter of all 2016 election coverage on the evening newscasts of NBC, CBS and ABC, more than all the Democratic campaigns combined. Observers noted Trump's ability to garner constant mainstream media coverage almost at will. However, Trump frequently criticized the media for writing what he alleged to be false stories about him, and he has called upon his supporters to be the silent majority. Trump also said the media put false meaning into the words "I say," and says he does not mind being criticized by the media as long as they are honest about it. Both Clinton and Trump were seen unfavorably by the general public, and their controversial nature set the tone of the campaign. Clinton's practice of using her own private email address and server during her time as Secretary of State in lieu of State Department service gained widespread public attention back in March 2015. Concerns were raised about security and preservation of emails and the possibility that laws may have been violated. After allegations were raised that some of the emails in question fell into this so-called born classified category, an FBI probe was initiated regarding how classified information was handled on the Clinton server. The FBI probe was concluded on July 5, 2016 with a recommendation of no charges, a recommendation that was followed by the Justice Department. On October 28, 11 days before the election, FBI Director James Comey informed Congress that the FBI was analyzing additional emails obtained during its investigation of an unrelated case. On November 6, he notified Congress that the new emails did not change the FBI's earlier conclusion. Also, on September 9, 2016, Clinton stated, "You know, just to be grossly generalistic, you could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables. They're racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it." Donald Trump criticized Clinton's remark as insulting his supporters. The following day, Clinton expressed regret for saying half, while insisting that Trump had deplorably amplified hateful views and voices. Previously, on August 25, 2016, Clinton gave a speech criticizing Trump's campaign for using racist lies and allowing the alt-right to gain prominence. On the other side, on October 7, 2016, video and accompanying audio were released by The Washington Post in which Trump referred obscenely to women in a 2005 conversation with Billy Bush while they were preparing to film an episode of Access Hollywood. The audio was met with a reaction of disbelief and disgust from the media. Following the revelation, Trump's campaign issued an apology, stating that the video was of a private conversation from many years ago. The incident was condemned by numerous prominent Republicans like Reince Priebus, Mitt Romney, John Kasich, Jeb Bush and the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. By October 8, several dozen Republicans had called for Trump to withdraw from the campaign and let Pence head the ticket. Trump insisted he would never drop out. The ongoing of the election made third parties attract voters' attention. On March 3, 2016, Libertarian Gary Johnson addressed the Conservative Political Action Conference in Washington, D.C., touting himself as the third-party option for anti-Trump Republicans. In early May, some commentators opined that Johnson was moderate enough to pull votes away from both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, who were very disliked and polarizing. Both conservative and liberal media noted that Johnson could get votes from Never Trump Republicans and disaffected Bernie Sanders supporters. Johnson also began to get time on national television, being invited on ABC News, NBC News, CBS News, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, Bloomberg, and many other networks. In September and October 2016, Johnson suffered a string of damaging stumbles when he has fielded questions about foreign affairs. On September 8, Johnson, when he appeared on MSNBC's Morning Joe, was asked by panelist Mike Barnicle, "What would you do if you were elected about Aleppo?" Johnson responded, "And what is Aleppo?" Johnson's "What is Aleppo?" question prompted widespread attention, much of it negative. Later that day, Johnson said that he had blanked and that he did understand the dynamics of the Syrian conflict. "I talk about them every day." On the other hand, Green Party candidate Jill Stein stated that the Democratic and Republican parties are two corporate parties that have converged into one. Concerned by the rise of the far right internationally and the tendency towards neoliberalism within the Democratic Party, she has said the answer to neo-fascism is stopping neoliberalism. Putting another Clinton in the White House will fan the flames of this right-wing extremism. In response to Johnson's growing poll numbers, the Hillary Clinton campaign and Democratic allies increased their criticism of Johnson in September 2016, warning that a vote for a third party is a vote for Donald Trump and deploying Senator Bernie Sanders to win over voters who might be considering voting for Johnson or for Stein. Campaign finance. This is an overview of the money used in the campaign as it is reported to Federal Election Commission and released in September 2016. Outside groups are independent expenditure-only committees, also called PACs and super PACs. The sources of the numbers are the FEC and Center for Responsive Politics. Some spending totals are not available due to withdrawals before the FEC deadline. As of September 2016, 10 candidates with ballot access have filed financial reports with the FEC. Newspaper endorsements. Clinton was endorsed by the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Houston Chronicle, the San Jose Mercury News, the Chicago Sun-Times, and the New York Daily News editorial boards. Trump, who has frequently criticized the mainstream media, was not endorsed by the vast majority of newspapers, with the Las Vegas Review-Journal, the Florida Times-Union, and the tabloid National Enquirer his highest-profile supporters. Several papers which endorse Clinton, such as the Houston Chronicle, the Dallas Morning News, the San Diego Union-Tribune, the Columbus Dispatch, and the Arizona Republic, endorsed their first Democratic candidate for many decades. USA Today, which had not endorsed any candidate since it was founded in 1982, broke tradition by giving an anti-endorsement against Trump, declaring him unfit for the presidency. The Atlantic, which has been in circulation since 1857, gave Clinton its third-ever endorsement. Other traditionally Republican papers, including the New Hampshire Union Leader, which had endorsed the Republican nominee in every election for the last 100 years, the Detroit News, which had not endorsed a non-Republican in its 143 years, and the Chicago Tribune, endorsed Gary Johnson. Russian involvement. On December 9, 2016, the Central Intelligence Agency issued an assessment to lawmakers in the U.S. Senate, stating that a Russian entity hacked the DNC and John Podesta's emails to assist Donald Trump. The Federal Bureau of Investigation agreed. President Barack Obama ordered a full inquiry into such possible intervention. Director of National Intelligence James R. Clapper in early January 2017 testified before a Senate committee that Russia's meddling in the 2016 presidential campaign went beyond hacking and included disinformation and the dissemination of fake news often promoted on social media. President-elect Trump originally called the report fabricated, and WikiLeaks denied any involvement by Russian authorities. Days later, Trump said he could be convinced of the Russian hacking if there is a unified presentation of evidence from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and other agencies. Several U.S. senators, including Republicans John McCain, Richard Burr, and Lindsey Graham, demanded a congressional investigation. The Senate Intelligence Committee announced the scope of their official inquiry on December 13, 2016 on a bipartisan basis. Work began on January 24, 2017. General election debates. The Commission on Presidential Debates, a non-profit organization, hosted debates between qualifying presidential and vice presidential candidates. According to the Commission's website, to be eligible to opt to participate in the anticipated debates, in addition to being constitutionally eligible, candidates must appear on a sufficient number of state ballots to have a mathematical chance of winning a majority vote in the Electoral College, and have a level of support of at least 15% of the national electorate as determined by 5 selected national public opinion polling organizations, using the average of those organizations' most recently publicly reported results. At the time of the determination, the 3 locations chosen to host the presidential debates and the 1 location selected to host the vice presidential debate were announced on September 23, 2015. The site of the first debate was originally designated as Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio. However, due to rising costs and security concerns, the debate was moved to Hofstra University in Hempstead, New York. On August 19, Trump's campaign manager confirmed that he would participate in a series of 3 debates. Trump had complained that 2 of the scheduled debates, one on September 26 and the other October 9, will have to compete for viewers with National Football League games, referencing the similar complaints made regarding the dates with low expected ratings. During the Democratic Party presidential debates, the free to host an open debate among all presidential candidates who had ballot access sufficient to represent a majority of electoral votes. In October 2016, free to all candidates with ballot lines representing at least 15% of the electoral vote. The nominees of the Democratic, Republican, Libertarian, Green, Constitution Reform and Socialism and Liberation parties, as well as independent candidate Evan McMullin, were invited to participate. The debate was held at the University of Colorado Boulder's Mackey Auditorium on October 25, 2016. It was moderated by Ed Asner and Christina Tobin, with Darrell Castle, Rocky de la Fuente, and Gloria La Riva participating. PBS hosted a debate moderated by Taya Smiley between Libertarian candidate Gary Johnson and Green Party candidate Jill Stein. Results. The election was held on November 8, 2016. Clinton cast her vote in the New York City suburb of Chappaqua, while Trump voted in a Manhattan public school. Throughout the day, the election process went more smoothly than many had expected, with only a few reports of long lines and equipment problems. The news media and election experts were surprised twice at Trump's winning the GOP nomination and in winning the Electoral College. English political scientist Lloyd Gruber says, "One of the major casualties of the 2016 election season has been the reputation of political science, a discipline whose practitioners had largely dismissed Donald Trump's chances of gaining the Republican nomination. The final polls showed a lead by Clinton, and indeed, she did win more popular votes. Trump himself expected to lose the election based on polling, and rented a small hotel ballroom to make a brief concession speech. "I said if we're going to lose, I don't want a big ballroom," he said. The Republican candidate performed surprisingly well in all battleground states, especially Florida, Iowa, Ohio, and North Carolina. Even Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, states that had been predicted to vote Democratic, were won by Trump. Cindy Adams, present at Trump Tower, reported that Trump Town knew they'd won by 5:30. Math calculations. Candidate dislike causing voter abstention begat the numbers. Trump said that he was surprised by how that map was getting red as hell. "That map was bleeding red. I always used to believing polls. I don't believe them anymore." On November 9, 2016 at 3 a.m. Eastern Time, Trump secured over 270 electoral votes, the majority of the 538 electors in the Electoral College, enough to make him the president-elect of the United States. Clinton called Trump early on Wednesday morning, conceding defeat. Clinton asked her supporters to accept the result and hoped that Trump would be a successful president for all Americans. In his victory speech, Trump appealed for unity, saying it is time for us to come together as one united people, and praised Clinton, who was owed a major debt of gratitude for her service to our country. 6 states plus a portion of Maine that Obama won in 2012 switched to Trump. These are Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Maine's 2nd congressional district. Initially, Trump won exactly 100 more Electoral College votes than Mitt Romney in 2012, with 2 lost to faithless electors the following month. 39 states swung more Republican compared to the previous presidential election, while 11 states and the District of Columbia swung more Democratic. It is estimated that 138.8 million Americans cast a ballot in 2016. 65.9 million of those ballots have been counted for Clinton and just under 63 million for Trump, representing 20.3% and 19.4% of the U.S. Census Bureau estimate of U.S. population that day of 324 million. Considering a voting age population of 250.6 million people, and voting eligible population of 230.6 million people, this is a turnout rate of 55.4% VAP and 60.2% VEP. Based on this estimate, voter turnout was up compared to 2012 but down compared to 2008. A FEC report of the 2016 presidential general election recorded an official total of 136.7 million votes cast for president, more than any prior election. Professor Michael McDonald of the University of Florida estimated the voter turnout rate for 2016 election to be 58.9% higher than the 2012 election turnout rate of 58% lower than the 61.6% turnout in the 2008 presidential election. Data scientist Azar Hamdan, working to explain the paradoxes the 2016 outcome, chief among them the discrepancy between the popular vote, which Hillary Clinton won by 2.8 million votes, and the Electoral College, where Trump won 304,227. Compare Trump's 30 states against Clinton's 20 states and the District of Columbia. He said that Trump outperformed Mitt Romney's 2012 results, while Clinton only just matched Barack Obama's 2012 totals. Hamdan also said that Trump was the highest vote earner of any Republican candidate ever, exceeding George W. Bush's 62.04 million votes in 2004, though neither reached Clinton's 65.9 million. nor Obama's 69.5 million votes in 2008, the overall record. He concluded, with help from the Cook Political Report, that the election hinged not on Clinton's large 2.8 million overall vote margin over Trump, but rather on about 78,000 votes from only 3 counties in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania and Michigan. Source: Nationwide, for Bernie Sanders and John Kasich, CA and NH, NC, PA, received electoral vote from a faithless elector. 2 faithless electors from Texas cast their presidential votes for Ron Paul and John Kasich, respectively. Chris Supran stated that he cast his presidential vote for John Kasich and his vice presidential vote for Carly Fiorina. The other faithless elector in Texas, Bill Green, cast his presidential vote for Ron Paul but cast his vice presidential vote for Mike Pence. As pledged, John Kasich received recorded write-in votes in Alabama, Georgia, Illinois, New Hampshire, North Carolina, Pennsylvania and Vermont. Candidate received votes as a write-in. The exact amounts of write-in votes for Sanders have been published for 3 states. In California, his official running mate was Tulsi Gabbard, and in New Hampshire and Vermont there was not a running mate attached to Sanders. It was possible to vote Sanders as a write-in candidate in 14 states. Results by state. A total of 29 third-party and independent presidential candidates appeared on the ballot in at least one state. Former Governor of New Mexico Gary Johnson and physician Jill Stein repeated their 2012 roles as the nominees for the Libertarian Party and the Green Party, respectively. With ballot access to the entire national electorate, Johnson received nearly 4.5 million votes, the highest nationwide vote share for a third-party candidate since Ross Perot in 1996. While Stein received almost 1.45 million votes, the most for a Green nominee since Ralph Nader in 2000. Independent candidate Evan McMullin, who appeared on the ballot in 11 states, received over 725,000 votes. He won 21.4% of the vote in his home state of Utah, the highest share of the vote for a third-party candidate in any state since 1992. Despite dropping out of the election following his defeat in the Democratic primary, Senator Bernie Sanders received 5.7% of the vote in his home state of Vermont, the highest write-in draft campaign percentage for a presidential candidate in American history. Johnson and McMullin were the first third-party candidates since Nader to receive at least 5% of the vote in one or more states, with Johnson crossing the mark in 11 states and McMullin crossing it in 2. Aside from Florida and North Carolina, the states which secured Trump's victory are situated in the Great Lakes, Rust Belt region. Wisconsin went Republican for the first time since 1984, while Pennsylvania and Michigan went Republican for the first time since 1988. Stein petitioned for a recount in these states. The Clinton campaign pledged to participate in the Green Party recount efforts, while Trump backers challenged them in court. Meanwhile, American Delta Party, Reform Party presidential candidate Rocky De La Fuente petitioned for and was granted a partial recount in Nevada. Electoral methods: 2 states allow for their electoral votes to be split between candidates. The winner within each congressional district gets 1 electoral vote for the district. The winner of the statewide vote gets 2 additional electoral votes. Results are from the New York Times. The column labeled "Margin shows Trump's margin of victory over Clinton." Close races. Red denotes states won by Republican Donald Trump, blue denotes those won by Democrat Hillary Clinton. States where the margin of victory was under 1%, states, districts. where the margin of victory was between 1% and 5%, states, where the margin of victory was between 5% and 10%. Battleground states. Most media outlets announced the beginning of the presidential race about 20 months prior to Election Day, soon after the first contestants declared their candidacy. Larry Sabato listed Virginia, Colorado, Iowa, New Hampshire, Florida, Nevada, and Ohio as the 7 states most likely to be contested in the general election. After Donald Trump clinched the Republican presidential nomination, many pundits felt that the major campaign locations might be different from what had originally been expected. Rust Belt states such as Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and even Michigan were thought to be in play with Trump as the nominee, while states with large minority populations such as Colorado and Virginia were expected to shift towards Clinton. By the convention's period and the debates, however, it did not seem as though the Rust Belt states could deliver a victory to Trump. According to Politico and the 538 online blog, his path to victory went those states such as Florida, North Carolina, Nevada, New Hampshire, and possibly Colorado. Early polling indicated a closer than usual race in former Democratic strongholds such as Washington, Delaware, New Jersey, Connecticut, Maine, and New Mexico. Meanwhile, research indicators from inside of a host of Republican-leaning states such as Arizona, Indiana, Georgia, South Carolina, Alaska, Utah, Texas, Kansas, Mississippi, Missouri, Montana, and South Dakota reported weaker support for Trump than expected, although the nominee's position solidified in a few other areas. Some reviews took this information as evidence of an expanded swing state map. A consensus among political pundits developed throughout the primary election season regarding swing states. From the results of presidential elections from 2004 through to 2012, the Democratic and Republican parties would generally start with a safe electoral vote count of about 150 to 200. However, the margins required to constitute a swing state are vague, and can vary between groups of analysts. It was thought that left-leaning states in the Rust Belt could become more conservative, as Trump had strong appeal among many blue-collar workers. They represent a large portion of the American populace, and were a major factor in Trump's eventual nomination. Trump's primary campaign was propelled by victories in Democratic states, and his supporters often did not identify as Republican. In addition, local factors may come into play. For example, Utah was the reddest state in 2012, although the Republican share was boosted significantly by the candidacy of Mormon candidate Mitt Romney. Despite its partisan orientation, some reports suggested a victory there by independent candidate Evan McMullin, particularly if there was a nationwide blowout. Media reports indicated that both candidates planned to concentrate on Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and North Carolina, among the Republican-leaning states. Potential Democratic targets included Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, Georgia, and Arizona. Trump's relatively poor polling in some traditionally Republican states such as Utah raised the possibility that they could vote for Clinton despite easy wins there by recent Republican nominees. However, many analysts asserted that these states were not yet viable Democratic destinations. Several sites and individuals publish electoral predictions. These generally rate the race by the likelihood for each party to win a state. The toss-up label is usually used to indicate that neither party has an advantage, lean to indicate a party has a slight edge, likely to indicate a party has a clear but not overwhelming advantage, and safe to indicate a party has an advantage that cannot be overcome. As the parameters of the race established themselves, analysts converged on a narrow list of contested states which were relatively similar to those of recent elections. On November 7, the Cook Political Report categorized Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Iowa, Michigan, Nevada, New Hampshire, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin as states with close races. Additionally, a district from each of Maine and Nebraska were considered to be coin flips. Meanwhile, 5 of 38 listed 22 states as potentially competitive about a month before the election. Maine's two at-large electoral votes: New Mexico, Minnesota, Michigan, Colorado, Virginia, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Nevada, Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, Iowa, Arizona, Georgia, Alaska, South Carolina, Texas, Indiana, Missouri, and Utah, as well as Maine's 2nd and Nebraska's 2nd congressional districts. Nate Silver, the publication's editor-in-chief, subsequently removed Texas, South Carolina, Missouri, and Indiana from the list after the race tightened significantly. These conclusions were supported by models such as the Princeton Elections Consortium, the New York Times Upshot, and punditry evaluations from Sabato's Crystal Ball and the Cook Political Report. Clinton won states like New Mexico by less than 10 percentage points. Among the states where the candidates finished at a margin of within 7%, Clinton won Virginia, Colorado, Maine, Minnesota, and New Hampshire. On the other hand, Trump won Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Florida, and North Carolina, Arizona, Nebraska's 2nd district, and Georgia. States won by Obama in the 2012 contests such as Ohio, Iowa, and Maine's 2nd district were also won by Trump. The close result in Maine was not expected by most commentators, nor were Trump's victory of over 10 points in the 2nd district and their disparities. The dramatic shift of Midwestern states towards Trump were contrasted in the media against the relative movement of Southern states towards the Democrats. For example, former Democratic strongholds such as Minnesota leaned towards the GOP, and Iowa voted more Republican than Texas did, while Arizona and Georgia were more Democratic than Ohio. Trump's smaller victories in Alaska and Utah also took some experts by surprise. Voter demographics. Voter demographic data for 2016 were collected by Edison Research for the National Election Pool, a consortium of ABC News, CBS News, MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, and the Associated Press. The voter survey is based on questionnaires completed by 24,537 voters, leaving 350 voting places throughout the United States on Election Day, in addition to 4,398 telephone interviews with early and absentee voters. Trump's crucial victories in the Midwest were aided in large part by his strong margins among non-college whites, while Obama lost those voters by a margin of 10 points in 2012. Clinton lost this group by 20%. The election also represented the first time that Republicans performed better among lower-income whites than among affluent white voters. To some analysts' surprise, Trump narrowed Clinton's margin compared to Obama by 7 points among blacks and African Americans, 8 points among Latinos, and 11 points among Asian Americans. Meanwhile, Trump increased his lead with non-Hispanic white voters through 1% over Mitt Romney's performance, and American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Pacific Islanders shifted their support towards the Republican candidate using the same relative amount. Additionally, although 74% of Muslim voters supported Clinton, Trump nearly doubled his support there compared to Mitt Romney, according to the New York Times exit poll. However, exit polls are believed to have overstated sectors of the electorate oftentimes in the past, and further study with additional data is generally recommended by experts, as it is considered to be a more accurate representation of voting behavior in presidential elections. Forecasting. Various methods were used to forecast the outcome of the 2016 election. For the 2016 election, there were many competing election forecast approaches, including Nate Silver's 5 of 38. The upshot at the New York Times Daily Kos Princeton Election Consortium Cook Political Report, Rothenberg and Gonzalez Polyvote Sabato's Crystal Ball and Electoral Vote. These models mostly showed a Democratic advantage since the nominees were confirmed, and were supported by pundits and statisticians including Nate Silver of 5 of 38, Nate Kaine at the New York Times, and Larry Sabato from the Crystal Ball newsletter, who predicted a Democratic victory in competitive presidential races, and projected consistent leads in several battleground states around the country. The near unanimity of forecasters in predicting a Clinton victory may have been the result of groupthink. However, 5 of 38's model pointed to the possibility of an Electoral College popular vote split widening in the final weeks based on Trump's improvement in swing states like Florida or Pennsylvania. This was due to the demographics targeted by Trump's campaign, which lived in big numbers there, in addition to Clinton's poor performance in several of those swing states in comparison with Obama's performance in 2012, as well as having a big number of her potential voters in very populated, traditionally blue states, but also in some very populated states traditionally red, like Texas, which were projected safe for Trump. Early exit polls generally favored Clinton. After the polls closed and some of the results came in, the forecasts were found to be inaccurate, as Trump performed better in the competitive Midwestern states such as Iowa, Ohio, and Minnesota than expected. 3 states which were considered to be part of Clinton's firewall were won by Trump. Of the states in the Great Lakes region, Clinton won the swing state of Minnesota by 1 point, as well as traditional Democratic strongholds such as New York and Illinois, with populous urban centers. This result stands in contrast to the 2012 results, when President Obama won all but Indiana, which he carried in 2008. This table displays the final polling average published by Real Clear Politics on November 7. The actual electoral margin and the overperformance by either candidate relative to the polls. Pollsters were puzzled by the failure of mainstream forecasting models to predict the 2016 election outcome. Sean Trend, writing for Real Clear Politics, wrote that many of the polls were accurate, but that the pundits' interpretation of these polls neglected polling error. Nate Silver found that the high amount of undecided and third-party voters in the election were neglected in many of these models, and that many of these voters decided to vote for Trump. 5 of 38's final polls plus forecast predicted 18 states, plus the 2nd congressional districts of Maine and Nebraska, with an interval of confidence lower than 90%. However, every major forecaster, including 5 of 38, the New York Times Upshot Prediction Markets aggregator, PredictWise election betting odds from Maxim Lott and John Stossel, the Daily Kos, the Princeton Election Consortium, the Huffington Post, the Cook Political Report, Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball, and the Rothenberg and Gonzalez Report, called every state the same way. The sole exception was Maine's 2nd congressional district. Of the forecasters who published results on the district, the Times gave Trump a 64% chance of winning and PredictWise a 52% chance. 5 of 38 gave Clinton a 51% chance of winning in polls only and 54% in polls plus. Princeton gave her a 60% chance. Cook labeled it a toss-up and Sabato leaned it towards Trump. The following table displays the final winning probabilities given by each outlet along with the final electoral result. The states shown have been identified by Politico, Whitboard, the New York Times, and the Crystal Ball as battlegrounds. Post-election events. Trump's victory, considered unlikely by most forecasts, was characterized as an upset and as shocking by the media. Both major party candidates were unusually old. At 70 years of age, Trump became the oldest person ever to be elected to a first term as president, surpassing Ronald Reagan, who was, upon winning the 1980 election, Clinton would have been the second oldest after Reagan, along with Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. Trump was born in 1946. This is the first time a single birth year has produced 3 presidents. Trump is the 5th president to be born in the state of New York after Martin Van Buren, Millard Fillmore, Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin D. Roosevelt. He is the 2nd president born in New York City after Theodore Roosevelt. Trump is also the 3rd president after James K. Polk in 1844 and Woodrow Wilson in 1916 to win an election despite losing his home state. Trump became the first person since Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1952 to be elected president without having been elected to any other previous office, and the only individual to be elected president without any prior political or military experience. Among other presidents with limited military or political experience, William Howard Taft never served in the military and had been elected to political office only once as an Ohio state judge, although he later held a number of appointed federal government positions, including in the cabinet of Theodore Roosevelt. Herbert Hoover did not serve in the military, and never held elected office, but he led 2 federal government agencies during and after World War I and served in the cabinets of 2 other presidents. However, Trump is unique in not having any state or federal government experience, military appointed or elected. Protests. Following the announcement of Trump's election, large protests broke out across the United States, with some continuing for several days. Protesters have held up a number of different signs and chanted various shouts, including "Not my president" and "We don't accept the president-elect." The movement, organized on Twitter under the hashtags #NTITrump and "Oak My President," high school and college students walked out of classes to protest. The protests were peaceful for the most part, although at some protests fires were lit, flags were burned, and people yelled derogatory remarks about Trump. Celebrities such as Madonna, Cher, and Lady Gaga took part in New York. Some protesters took to blocking freeways in Los Angeles, San Diego and Portland, Oregon, and were dispersed by police in the early hours of the morning. In a number of cities, protesters were dispersed with rubber bullets, pepper spray, and beanbags fired by police. In New York City, calls were made to continue the protests over the coming days after the election. Former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani called protesters a bunch of spoiled crybabies. Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti expressed understanding of the protests and praised those who peacefully wanted to make their voices heard. Vote tampering concerns. After the election, computer scientists including J. Alex Haldeman, the director of the University of Michigan Center for Computer Security and Society, urged the Clinton campaign to request an election recount in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, for the purpose of excluding the possibility that the hacking of electronic voting machines had influenced the recorded outcome. However, statistician Nate Silver performed a regression analysis which demonstrated that the alleged discrepancy between paper ballots and electronic voting machines completely disappears once you control for race and education level. On November 25, 2016, the Obama administration said the results from November 8 accurately reflect the will of the American people. The following day, the White House released another statement saying the federal government did not observe any increased level of malicious cyber activity aimed at disrupting our electoral process on Election Day. Recount petitions. On November 23, Green Party presidential candidate Jill Stein launched a public fundraiser to pay for recounts in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, asserting that the election's outcome had been affected by hacking in those states. Stein did not provide evidence for her claims. Changing the outcome of these three states would make Clinton the winner, and this would require showing that less than 60,000 votes had been counted for Trump, which should have been counted for Clinton. Stein filed for a recount in Wisconsin on November 25, after which Clinton campaign general counsel Mark Elias stated that their campaign would join Stein's recount efforts in that state and possibly others in order to ensure the process proceeds in a manner that is fair to all sides. Stein subsequently filed for a recount in Pennsylvania on November 28 and in Michigan on November 30. Concurrently, American Delta Party, Reform Party presidential candidate Rocky De La Fuente sought and was granted a partial recount in Nevada that was unrelated to Stein's efforts. President-elect Donald Trump issued a statement denouncing Stein's Wisconsin recount request, saying, "The people have spoken and the election is over." Trump further commented that the recount is a scam by the Green Party for an election that has already been conceded. The Trump campaign and Republican Party officials moved to block Stein's three recount efforts through state and federal courts. U.S. District Judge Mark Goldsmith ordered a halt to the recount in Michigan on December 7, dissolving a previous temporary restraining order against the Michigan Board of Elections that allowed the recount to continue, stating in his order, "Plaintiffs have not presented evidence of tampering or mistake. Instead, they present speculative claims going to the vulnerability of the voting machinery, but not actual injury." On December 12, U.S. District Judge Paul Diamond rejected an appeal by the Green Party and Jill Stein to force a recount in Pennsylvania, stating that suspicion of a hacked Pennsylvania election borders on the irrational, and that granting the Green Party's recount bid could ensure that no Pennsylvania vote counts, given the December 13, 2016 federal deadline to certify the vote for the Electoral College. Meanwhile, the Wisconsin recount was allowed to continue as it was nearing completion and had uncovered no significant irregularities. The recounts in Wisconsin and Nevada were completed on schedule, resulting in only minor changes to vote tallies. A partial recount of Michigan ballot found some precinct imbalances in Detroit, which were corrected. A subsequent state order found no evidence of voter fraud, and concluded that the mistakes, which were almost entirely caused by poll worker mistakes attributed to poor training, did not impair the ability of Detroit residents to cast a ballot and have their vote counted. The overall outcome of the election remained unchanged by the recount efforts. Electoral College lobbying. Intense lobbying and grassroots campaigns have been directed at various GOP electors of the United States Electoral College to convince a sufficient number of them to not vote for Trump, thus precluding a Trump presidency. Members of the Electoral College themselves started a campaign for other members to vote their conscience for the good of America in accordance with Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Paper No. 68. This group's members may have become faithless electors in the presidential election. On December 5, former candidate Lawrence Lessig and attorney Lawrence Tribe established the Electors Trust under the aegis of Equal Citizens, U.S., to provide pro bono legal counsel as well as a secure communications platform for members of the Electoral College who were regarding a vote of conscience against Trump. On December 6, Colorado Secretary of State Wayne W. Williams castigated Democratic electors who had filed a lawsuit in federal court to have the state law binding them to the popular vote overturned. On December 10, 10 electors, in an open letter headed by Christine Pelosi to the Director of National Intelligence James Clapper, demanded an intelligence briefing in light of Russian interference in the election to help Trump win the presidency. 58 additional electors subsequently added their names to the letter, bringing the total to 68 electors from 17 different states. On December 16, the briefing request was denied. On December 19, several electors voted against their pledged candidates, 2 against Trump and 5 against Clinton. A further 3 electors attempted to vote against Clinton, but were replaced or forced to vote again. The 115th United States Congress officially certified the results on January 6, 2017. Faithless electors. In the Electoral College vote on December 19 for the first time since 1808, multiple faithless electors voted against their pledged qualified presidential candidate. 5 Democrats rebelled in Washington and Hawaii, while 2 Republicans rebelled in Texas. 2 Democratic electors, 1 in Minnesota and 1 in Colorado, were replaced after voting for Bernie Sanders and John Kasich, respectively. Electors in Maine conducted a second vote after one of its members voted for Sanders. The elector then voted for Clinton. Likewise, for the first time since 1896, multiple faithless electors voted against the pledged qualified vice presidential candidate. Of the faithless votes, Colin Powell and Elizabeth Warren were the only 2 to receive more than 1. Powell received 3 electoral votes for president and Warren received 2 for vice president. Receiving 1 valid electoral vote each were Sanders, John Kasich, Ron Paul, and Faith Spotted Eagle for president, and Carly Fiorina, Susan Collins, Winona LaDuke, and Maria Cantwell for vice president. Sanders is the first Jewish American to receive an electoral vote for president. LaDuke is the first Green Party member to receive an electoral vote, and Paul is the 3rd member of the Libertarian Party to do so, following the party's presidential and vice presidential nominees each getting 1 vote in 1972. It is the first election with faithless electors from more than one political party. The 7 people to receive electoral votes for president were the most in a single election since 1796 and more than any other election since the enactment of the 12th Amendment in 1804. Brought to you by WikiVidi.com. Would you like to know more?